Ron Wyatt said that he found chariot wheels at the bottom of the Gulf of Aqaba, which he identified as the Red Sea.
What if a 3,000-year-old mystery was hiding just beneath the waves, and someone finally found it? No treasure maps, no legends of lost cities, just a strange underwater discovery in the Red Sea that has experts arguing, believers buzzing, and skeptics scrambling for answers. Is it myth, coincidence, or something far more real than we ever imagined?
If there were chariots found in the Red Sea, it would probably have something to do with the crossing of the sea.
They say the ocean holds secrets. Some stay buried for centuries, untouched by time. Others eventually rise to the surface, revealing something that challenges what we thought we knew.
If you went into that wadi, you would find there are rocks all over the place, but they've all been pushed out of the way to make a path. Somebody pushed all the rocks out of the way to make a path for wagons, apparently.
For decades, one particular story has lived in the space between legend and belief. The idea that ancient chariots might lie at the bottom of the Red Sea, tied to a moment described in one of the world's oldest religious texts. In late 2024, an unusual team of divers quietly entered the waters off the Gulf of Aqaba, near the coast of Nuweiba Beach. This wasn't a recreational dive, nor a hunt for sunken treasure. Their goal wasn't riches or headlines. They were after something much more elusive: the possibility of physical evidence linked to the biblical account of the Exodus. The story of the Exodus is well known to many. According to the Hebrew Bible, Moses led the Israelites out of slavery in Egypt. Pursued by Pharaoh's army, they came to the edge of the Red Sea. Trapped between the water and the soldiers behind them, they faced what seemed like certain defeat. But then, the story says, the sea parted. The Israelites crossed on dry land, and as Pharaoh's chariots followed, the waters returned, swallowing the army whole. For centuries, this story has inspired countless generations. At the same time, it has also been the subject of intense scrutiny. Scholars, scientists, and theologians have debated its historical accuracy, with many dismissing the parting of the sea as symbolic or metaphorical. The lack of tangible evidence, no ruins, no weapons, no chariots, has only deepened the doubts. But that hasn't stopped some people from searching. The 2024 expedition was different in many ways. Unlike traditional academic projects, this team operated under the radar. There were no press releases, no university partnerships, and no journal articles announcing their plans. Instead, they moved quietly, launching from a relatively secluded stretch of shoreline with limited public or governmental oversight. The team itself was made up of a mix of professionals from various fields. Among them were former military divers, marine engineers, and consultants in underwater archaeology. Their approach was methodical and well-resourced, more like a classified operation than a scientific mission. Every piece of their equipment was chosen with care. They used high-resolution sonar scanners, sediment analysis tools, AI-assisted underwater drones, and advanced imaging software. Technology designed to detect and map objects buried beneath years of sediment and marine growth. Their goal was not to confirm a miracle. It was to examine a hypothesis that something unusual might be resting on the seafloor in a location that has long been speculated to match the biblical crossing point. Their focus on the Gulf of Aqaba wasn't random. Over the years, some independent researchers, including biblical cartographers and amateur explorers, have suggested that this stretch of water, rather than the traditionally accepted Gulf of Suez, better matches the geographical clues described in the Book of Exodus. In particular, the underwater topography between Nuweiba Beach and the opposite Arabian coast shows signs of what's known as a submerged land bridge, a relatively shallow, wide, and flat area of seabed that could, in theory, have been exposed if the water were somehow displaced. This theory has existed for some time but has never been widely accepted in mainstream academic circles. Many scientists have considered it too speculative or rooted too deeply in religious belief rather than in hard evidence. However, the team behind the 2024 mission believed that with the right technology, it might finally be possible to explore the area with greater clarity than ever before. Before the dive even began, the project faced challenges. According to sources familiar with the operation, several governments in the region were hesitant or openly resistant. citing concerns around safety, territorial sovereignty, and cultural preservation. Some officials reportedly issued warnings or denied permits. Universities that were contacted for support reportedly declined to participate, labeling the effort pseudoscientific or politically sensitive. Despite this opposition, the mission moved forward. Behind it was a group of private investors who chose to remain mostly anonymous. From what's known, these were individuals with both the financial means and the personal conviction to support the search. They were described as people of strong faith, but also pragmatists, interested not just in proving a religious story, but in solving a historical puzzle. It's important to point out that this wasn't the first time someone had gone looking for evidence at the bottom of the Red Sea. In the late 20th century, a man named Ron Wyatt made headlines for claiming he had found chariot wheels and other objects encrusted in coral at the bottom of the Gulf of Aqaba. His claims were never verified through peer-reviewed research, and many in the academic world dismissed him as a fringe figure. Still, his stories captured the imagination of many, especially in religious communities, and laid the foundation for others to follow. What made the 2024 dive different was the scale and sophistication of the operation. It wasn't just a man with a scuba tank and a camera. It was a coordinated effort involving drone submersibles, remote scanning arrays, and geological analysis tools. The team was prepared to gather not just photographs, but data, layered scans, pattern recognition models, and sonar maps that could be analyzed independently by outside experts if ever released. As with any expedition of this nature, security and secrecy were high priorities, not only to avoid interference, but also to manage expectations. The team understood the weight of what they were investigating. A discovery of this kind wouldn't just have historical or religious implications, it would raise questions across disciplines, from archaeology and geology to theology and geopolitics. In today's connected world, even secret missions can't stay hidden forever. Despite efforts to keep the dive confidential, word began to leak online. A blurry photo showed submersible drones being prepared on a beach marked with Hebrew phrases that many believed were scriptural references. It didn't take long for speculation to spread. Theories popped up on social media, prophecy blogs, and conspiracy forums. Some claimed the discovery of ancient relics was imminent. Others dismissed it all as a hoax or a stunt. Still, the buzz was enough to draw global attention. Soon the story had a name: Back to Where the Pharaoh Fell. Though unofficial, the phrase spread quickly and sparked renewed interest in the question. Could the biblical account of the Red Sea crossing be rooted in actual events? At this stage, the divers hadn't revealed what, if anything, they had found. But anticipation was building. For those who believed in the possibility, it wasn't just about proving a story. It was about connecting the past to the present, about finding a thread of truth in a sea of doubt. For skeptics, it was an opportunity to finally put the question to rest. To understand the significance of what may or may not have been discovered in the Red Sea, it's necessary to go back, far beyond 2024, to the roots of the story that has driven so much speculation. The Exodus is one of the most well-known and often debated narratives in religious history. It's found in the Hebrew Bible, the Christian Old Testament, and referenced in Islamic texts. The core of the story is consistent across all three. A group of enslaved people, the Israelites, are led out of Egypt by Moses. After a series of plagues that strike the Egyptian population, the Pharaoh finally allows them to leave. But soon after, he changes his mind and sends his army to recapture them. According to the biblical account, this chase ends at the edge of the Red Sea, where the Israelites seem to be trapped. In a dramatic moment, Moses raises his staff, the waters part, and the people cross on dry land. As Pharaoh's chariots pursue them, the sea collapses, drowning the Egyptian army. For centuries, this moment has stood as a symbol of faith, freedom, and divine intervention. It forms a cornerstone in religious teachings and has been depicted in countless works of art, literature, and film. However, when it comes to physical evidence, things become more complicated. Historians and archaeologists have long debated whether the Exodus actually happened, and if so, how. One of the biggest challenges is the lack of direct archaeological proof. Despite many efforts, no Hebrew encampments, weapon fragments, or Egyptian military remains have been definitively found in the Sinai Peninsula, the area most traditionally linked with the biblical journey. Over time, alternative theories have emerged to explain or reinterpret the story. Some scholars suggest that the Red Sea mentioned in the Bible was mistranslated. The original Hebrew phrase, Yam Suf, has sometimes been translated as Sea of Reeds, which could refer to a shallow marshland rather than a deep body of water. In this version of events, the crossing would have occurred in a low-lying swamp area, possibly during an unusual wind-driven tide event. Others have pointed to the Gulf of Suez, another arm of the Red Sea closer to Egypt's western border. But again, evidence there has been inconclusive at best. Then there's the less conventional theory, the one that places the crossing at the Gulf of Aqaba near Nuweiba Beach. This theory didn't originate in mainstream academic circles, but rather through a combination of independent exploration, religious research, and detailed map analysis. Over time, proponents of this view began to argue that the geography in this region matches the biblical description more closely than other proposed sites. A key part of their claim centers on an underwater landform between the Egyptian and Saudi Arabian coasts. Sonar maps of the Gulf of Aqaba show a natural ridge stretching across the seabed, a kind of submerged causeway that is significantly shallower than the deep waters surrounding it. In theory, if the sea were somehow pushed back, this ridge could provide a walkable path across the sea floor. This idea remained on the fringes of historical research for many years, mostly supported by amateur investigators and religious enthusiasts. But the possibility that such a landform exists, combined with new diving technologies, encouraged some to take a second look. One of the earliest and most vocal proponents of the Gulf of Aqaba theory was Ron Wyatt, a former nurse anesthetist from Tennessee. Wyatt wasn't a trained archaeologist, but he spent much of his life searching for physical proof of biblical events. In the late 1970s and 1980s, he traveled across the Middle East, exploring sites that he believed aligned with the biblical narrative. In 1978, he made one of his first dives in the Gulf of Aqaba, and the claims he later made would spark both curiosity and controversy. Wyatt reported finding several coral-covered shapes on the seafloor that resembled chariot wheels. He described wheels with 4, 6, and even 8 spokes, arranged in ways that suggested axles and symmetrical construction. He claimed to see human bones, horse remains, and other fragments that hinted at a battlefield lying beneath the waves. According to his own accounts, these objects weren't random. They appeared in patterns, spread across the seabed in a way that suggested a sudden, violent event, possibly consistent with the drowning of an army. However, Wyatt's findings were never formally verified. He didn't publish peer-reviewed research or work with established archaeological institutions. Instead, he shared his discoveries through religious media, church presentations, and independent documentaries. Photos and grainy video footage showed divers next to coral formations, but experts were quick to point out that coral is a highly adaptable organism. It can grow over almost anything, and over time take on nearly any shape. This makes identifying man-made objects in coral-rich waters extremely difficult, especially without removing and testing the objects, something Wyatt was reportedly unable to do due to legal restrictions. The Egyptian Antiquities Authority, known for its strict oversight of archaeological work, has long prohibited the removal of artifacts from underwater sites without rigorous permits and official supervision. Wyatt claimed he applied for permission multiple times but was consistently denied. In one of his most controversial statements, he said that he once spotted a wheel coated in what appeared to be gold or a gold-like metal. He claimed that he reported it to the authorities, who then took possession of it. No photos were taken, and no official confirmation followed. For many, this part of the story was simply too convenient to be believed. For others, it was further proof of institutional resistance to findings that challenge conventional historical narratives. Wyatt became a polarizing figure. In academic circles, he was mostly dismissed, but among certain religious communities, he was regarded with deep respect. His story was passed from church to church, sermon to sermon, and eventually gained a kind of legendary status. For every skeptic, there were believers who felt Wyatt had uncovered something important, even if he didn't have the credentials or resources to prove it conclusively. Over the years, others followed in Wyatt's footsteps. Some were pastors or missionaries. Others were amateur researchers equipped with modern cameras and underwater drones. Several dive teams claim to have found similar coral-covered shapes. Videos uploaded to YouTube and religious forums showed structures that seemed too symmetrical to be natural. Yet the academic world remained unconvinced, often citing confirmation bias and lack of verifiable data. Still, the fascination persisted. If Wyatt had exaggerated, was there still a kernel of truth in his findings? Could there be objects beneath the Gulf of Aqaba that modern technology could now examine more effectively? That's the question the 2024 dive team wanted to answer. Unlike Wyatt, they had access to cutting-edge tools that could analyze the seabed without physically removing anything. Their aim wasn't to prove faith through archaeology, but to take a second look at a theory that had never been properly explored with modern methods. They also had something Wyatt didn't: time and planning. The 2024 team reportedly spent months preparing. They studied sonar maps, consulted underwater terrain experts, and trained in deep-sea navigation. Every stage of the dive was documented and every scan was archived. Their hope was that if anything unusual was found, it could be analyzed objectively, perhaps even by skeptics. But they were also aware of the risks. Reigniting a theory that's long been labeled pseudoscientific carries professional consequences. There's a fine line between open-minded inquiry and perceived credulity. Still, the team believed the possibility was worth investigating, not to rewrite history overnight, but to bring new data to a centuries-old debate. Whether Ron Wyatt was right or not remains uncertain. What is clear, though, is that his work inspired a new wave of exploration. And with new technology and a renewed sense of curiosity, the question remains open. What, if anything, lies beneath the waves at Nuweiba Beach? The breakthrough came not from what was seen on the surface, but from the patterns picked up by their equipment. As the drones scanned deeper and broader areas of the seafloor, shapes began to emerge. Patterns that didn't match the randomness of natural formations. These were not just coral clusters or erosion marks. Some of the shapes appeared circular, repeated in evenly spaced intervals. Others had lines connecting them, structures that suggested geometry rather than natural growth. The team began to focus their efforts on a specific section of the ridge, where the shapes seemed to cluster with more regularity. Then came something unexpected. One of the submersibles picked up a reflective glint from beneath a layer of sediment. It was small, almost imperceptible, but stood out sharply against the otherwise muted colors of the seabed. The drone adjusted position, scanned the area again, and captured clearer footage. A circular object, partially encrusted in coral and sand, gave off a faint metallic gleam. It was unclear whether it was metal or a naturally occurring mineral deposit. But the shape, round, symmetrical, with spoke-like impressions, was enough to prompt a human dive. Divers were sent down to the location equipped with high-definition underwater cameras. As they approached, what had appeared on sonar began to take physical shape. Embedded in the seabed were formations that resembled wheels, axles, and possibly fragmented human and animal bones. One diver described the scene as a kind of suspended chaos. Objects were scattered, but not randomly. They seemed frozen mid-motion, oriented in similar directions, as if caught in a wave and dropped all at once. Some pieces showed signs of impact, snapped shapes, bent forms, and unnatural angles that suggested a sudden and violent force had acted upon them. Among the findings were curved structures that matched the typical dimensions of chariot wheels described in ancient Egyptian iconography. In some places, coral growth had preserved the outer contours, forming hollow shells where organic material had long decayed. Other objects had metal-like qualities, with fragments that reflected light and maintained rigid edges. The divers also recorded what appeared to be human femurs, horse jawbones, and even vertebrae, all heavily encrusted but distinguishable through shape and relative placement. The deeper the team explored, the more evidence they collected. While they remained cautious not to make definitive claims on site, their footage was compelling. It showed a clear concentration of symmetrical and connected shapes in a location long associated with the biblical crossing. Though none of the team made public statements at that time, those present later described the experience as both surreal and sobering. They weren't looking at a museum exhibit. They were looking at the seafloor, unfiltered, unpolished, and possibly unchanged since the time of the event they were investigating. What followed next was almost inevitable. Despite the team's efforts to keep the dive under wraps, snippets of footage began leaking online. At first, they appeared in obscure forums and faith-based websites. Short clips showing coral-encrusted shapes, sonar overlays, and muffled audio of excited voices. But the internet has a way of amplifying stories quickly. Within days, the clips began to circulate on larger platforms. TikTok videos featured quick cuts of the underwater scenes paired with dramatic music and verses from the Book of Exodus. YouTube creators analyzed the footage frame by frame, comparing it to Egyptian artifacts and old accounts from divers like Ron Wyatt. The public reaction was immediate and intense. Some viewed the leaks as validation of long-held beliefs. Others dismissed them as yet another round of conspiracy theories. Mainstream news outlets were cautious. A few ran short stories labeling the images as possible archaeological anomalies, while others avoided the topic altogether. Some segments of the media ridiculed the idea outright, with talk show hosts and commentators using it as comedic material. But while the world argued, something strange began to happen. The videos started disappearing. Entire TikTok accounts were suddenly suspended. YouTube channels that had uploaded the clips found their content removed for policy violations. Threads discussing the dive were locked or deleted on several forums. In some cases, cloud storage links shared among researchers and enthusiasts were rendered inactive. Official reasons varied. Some claimed copyright concerns, others pointed to the unverified nature of the footage. But to many people watching from the outside, it looked like something more, something coordinated. This perceived censorship only fueled the fire. Viewers began comparing the new dive footage with Ron Wyatt's old recordings. The parallels were striking. In both cases, the same location had been explored. In both, coral-covered wheels and scattered remains had been documented. And in both, the findings faced immediate dismissal and controversy. For many, it was no longer about whether the footage was real, but why it was being suppressed. As debate intensified online, conversations began to shift offline as well. Churches hosted screenings of the leaked footage. Faith leaders spoke about the possible implications in sermons. Independent documentary makers rushed to produce content based on the material before it vanished completely. For some, this wasn't just a story, it was a confirmation. A chance to see their faith intersect with physical history in a way that had never been publicly acknowledged. Meanwhile, academic circles were forced to take notice. Scholars who had previously ignored or dismissed the Gulf of Aqaba theory began re-examining the geological data and location reports. Some remained firmly skeptical, pointing out the need for peer-reviewed analysis and proper excavation methods. Others acknowledged that while the evidence was far from conclusive, it warranted further investigation. For the dive team, the sudden attention came with mixed emotions. On one hand, their work was finally being noticed. On the other, the mission had never been designed for public spectacle. Some members reportedly feared that the online reaction would undermine the seriousness of their findings, casting everything into the realm of conspiracy and sensationalism. Others saw the viral interest as an opportunity to push for wider support and formal recognition of their data. The pressure also began to mount from institutional and governmental bodies. According to several reports, regional authorities expressed concern about the release of unauthorized footage from sovereign waters. Legal complications emerged around the handling of potentially ancient remains. Questions were raised about whether any artifacts had been removed or disturbed, and if so, whether that violated international heritage laws. Despite the controversy, one thing became clear. The 2024 dive had reignited a debate that had never fully disappeared. It reminded the world that archaeology, history, and belief are often deeply intertwined, and not always comfortably so. It also highlighted the power of modern technology in challenging long-held assumptions. Sonar, AI, and underwater imaging had revealed patterns that could not easily be dismissed. Whether those patterns represented proof of an ancient miracle or merely coincidental formations remained open to interpretation. But for many, the discovery, whatever it ultimately proved to be, had already changed the conversation. It wasn't just about coral shapes or ancient wheels. It was about the possibility that something long thought to be metaphorical might have left a physical trace after all. And in that sense, the story had already crossed a threshold. It's not a coincidence. Over the past 2 decades, advancements in technology have completely reshaped how we study the past. Tools like ground-penetrating radar, aerial drones, satellite imaging, AI-powered document analysis, and underwater mapping systems have allowed researchers to explore areas that were previously unreachable or too difficult to study in detail. Remote regions, once obscured by geography or conflict, are now accessible in ways that were impossible just a few years ago. Entire landscapes can be scanned, mapped, and modeled with incredible precision, revealing hidden structures, anomalies, and artifacts that had gone unnoticed for centuries. This change in capability has led to a change in mindset. Where earlier researchers might have dismissed certain biblical accounts as purely symbolic, some are now reconsidering them as potentially historical descriptions that were simply too challenging to investigate until now. It doesn't mean the texts are being taken at face value or without criticism. It means that new questions are being asked with new tools in hand. One area seeing renewed interest is the region around ancient Jericho. According to the Bible, the walls of the city fell suddenly as the Israelites marched around it. For decades, this account was written off as metaphorical or exaggerated. But recent excavations and structural analysis of the site have revealed signs that some sections of the city's fortifications did, in fact, collapse in a sudden and catastrophic manner. While not conclusive proof of the biblical story, the findings challenge earlier assumptions and raise new possibilities. Similar shifts are happening elsewhere. Near Mount Ararat, long linked to the story of Noah's Ark, advanced aerial scanning has revealed a number of unusual formations in remote mountain zones. While none have been confirmed as anything more than natural geology, the discoveries are prompting further investigation, often led by independent researchers and supported by private funding, rather than universities or government institutions. The pattern is becoming clear. Across different regions and stories, technology is revealing things that require us to look again, and not just with skepticism, but with curiosity. For some, these findings support long-held beliefs. For others, they raise complex questions about how myth, memory, and history interact. In the case of the Red Sea crossing, the implications are particularly layered. If even part of the 2024 findings are confirmed, it could have consequences for how religious texts are approached in both academic and public contexts. It wouldn't mean that every miracle described in ancient scripture is now proven fact. But it would mean that we can't dismiss these accounts quite as easily as we might have before. More than anything, it would mark a shift in how science and faith engage with each other. For much of modern history, the relationship between the two has been seen as oppositional, faith dealing in belief, science dealing in evidence. But increasingly, the boundaries between those categories are being tested. Some of the most exciting discoveries are coming not from established institutions, but from collaborations between believers, explorers, and technologists. People who aren't afraid to ask, "What if?" and who have the tools to explore those questions seriously. This new wave of biblical archaeology is less about proving religion and more about exploring possibility. It's not about turning faith into science or science into faith. It's about allowing room for both to inform each other, to test each other, and to engage in a shared search for truth. That's why the question isn't just, did the Exodus happen? Or, are those chariot wheels real? The bigger question is, what else have we missed? If the seabed of the Red Sea holds clues that were overlooked or dismissed for decades, what else might lie beneath the surface of history waiting to be uncovered? Consider the wider stories. The manna that reportedly fed the Israelites in the desert. The fire that fell on Mount Carmel in Elijah's time. The river that turned to blood in the plagues of Egypt. The sun that is said to have stood still during a battle in Jericho. Could these be purely symbolic? Or might some be based on natural events that were observed, remembered, and later recorded with the language of the divine? This doesn't mean abandoning critical thinking or embracing every claim without scrutiny, but it does suggest that our understanding of ancient history may be incomplete, not just because of a lack of data, but because of the assumptions we've made about what's possible. Some experts argue that history isn't just about the past, it's also about interpretation. The way we understand events depends not only on the facts we can prove, but also on the lens through which we view them. If the lens is too narrow, focused only on what fits current models or ideologies, we risk missing key parts of the picture. That's why this moment matters. Because for perhaps the first time in a long while, that lens is widening. The dive at the Gulf of Aqaba isn't just a story about underwater shapes or ancient relics. It's about rethinking how we approach the unknown. It's about recognizing that some answers might require us to question long-standing beliefs. Not just religious ones, but scientific and historical ones too. Of course, not everyone welcomes this shift. For some in the academic world, the return of biblical archaeology raises concerns about methodology, credibility, and the risk of conflating faith with fact. Those are valid concerns. Any claim, especially one with theological implications, should be subject to rigorous testing and open debate. At the same time, the outright dismissal of discoveries based solely on their source or implications can also be a form of bias. This is why transparency matters. If the data from the 2024 dive is ever released in full, if it can be verified, peer-reviewed, and replicated, it could mark a turning point. It would allow the discussion to move out of internet forums and into serious academic dialogue. And it would give both believers and skeptics a common ground to work from, the evidence itself. Until then, the conversation continues, not just online, but in classrooms, places of worship, and living rooms around the world. People are asking questions again about what they were taught, what they believe, and what might still be uncovered. Whether or not the chariot wheels are real, the impact of the story is undeniable. It has reignited curiosity, brought new energy to forgotten research, and challenged the idea that the past is already fully understood. In many ways, that might be the most important discovery of all. Because history doesn't only live in textbooks and museum cases, sometimes it lives beneath the waves, and sometimes it waits, buried in coral, scattered across a seabed, or hidden in plain sight, until someone decides to look again. So where do we go from here? That's a question each viewer has to answer for themselves. Maybe the dive team uncovered something extraordinary. Maybe the story will fade like so many before it. But maybe, just maybe, this is only the beginning. Because the past isn't dead, it's not even buried, but it's waiting to be rediscovered.